One of the things which I know you believe is that the Belmont principles were in many ways distinctly American. And of the three principles, one thinks of the beneficence principle as being an aspect, a universal aspect of healthcare, the physician-patient relationship. And likewise, whether it's always fulfilled, the notion of justice or fairness is something which is a universal principle, often in its absence, but it recognizes universal. Respect for persons, is that a distinctly American or European, Western European American idea that doesn't travel well in your view?
It's most unfortunate that the National Commission chose that name for its principle, because that is the name that Immanuel Kant gave to the principle arising from his so-called categorical imperative. And so many people who see that think, aha, the Commission has adopted a Kantian stance. Which is not at all what they had in mind. Now, Kant never said a word about autonomy. Kant, or not autonomy in the sense it's used in the National Commission in the Belmont Report. Kant referred to autonomy in the sense of self-governing. And his, I don't want to get too tangled up in the philosophical meanings of all of this. But I think if you stick to the basic language of the principle as Kant framed it, that people are not to be used as merely as means. People are not instrumentalities. People are, in his language, ends in themselves. This is fine. This relates to traditions that existed long before Kant, traditions arising out of the religious traditions of Christianity, Judaism, probably many other religions that I'm not aware of. They talk to the infinite value of each human being. And that's basically what Kant captured. His contribution was to put it in secular philosophical terms so that you didn't have to be grounded in any particular religious tradition or storied community in order to appreciate the grounds, the warrants for his position. Now, the way the National Commission frames it is that respect for persons has to do with autonomy in the self of picking and choosing for yourself what you want to do or what you're willing to do. And it even goes so far as to say that people who are not autonomous in this sense are entitled to certain types of protection. And I think in that way they're lapsing on over into what we usually discuss under the rubric of justice. Self-determination is another way of putting what the National Commission was talking about. And self-determination, actually, the theoretical grounding for liberty to do your own thing makes sense only in a culture that has lived through what we in the Western world call the Enlightenment. All of the Enlightenment philosophy had to do with getting the king off the backs of the people. You referred to the Magna Carta during the meeting earlier today. Self-determination is not that important a principle in the majority of the world. They have very much more communitarian ethics in all of Africa, in all of Asia, in the majority of the world. So this principle doesn't really fit well there as it's articulated by the National Commission.
Is that a major problem today when those principles have been picked up through the Declaration of Helsinki, which had some of that, and initially it was more on the beneficent side, the doctor making choices, but today, as manifested, and the effect of Western bioethics in shaping thinking, so that at the universities around the world, at least the educators are saying, well, these are the principles. Does it not work in reality?
I'm not sure about that. I think as I have traveled around the world, I find that most of the countries of the world have learned our language. And they will say, aha, respect for persons, informed consent. But if you go probe deeply into what they're talking about, informed consent does not have the meaning in sub-Saharan Africa that it has in Boston. Basically, they're living in many of the village cultures of sub-Saharan Africa. If you don't go along with what the community and whatever its system of governance might be, if you don't go along with what they've decided, you're considered either crazy or a deviant.
Disrespectful of the leadership and so forth.
Sure. Even in Europe, in Norway, I was told that they don't tolerate people who want to be individualistic all that well. A saying that I was told that they had there was, if somebody tries to rise up above the crowd, they hammer them down.
So is bioethics guilty then, or research ethics guilty then, of spending too much time debating the philosophical niceties when it's really the anthropological, sociological reality that ought to be the focus?
That's a very good way of putting it. One of the projects I had in my work in international research ethics and in developing guidelines for international documents was to engage and involve anthropologists. I got some very forceful pushback from people on the international ethics scene, particularly from the people who were philosophers to begin with, and even more specifically from the people who were analytic philosophers. The analytic philosophers has almost as an article of faith that ethical principles can be and ought to be universal. I've heard one go even so far as to say that if you have a valid principle that applies in Boston, it's equally valid in Beijing, and if we ever discover human-like life on Jupiter, it will be valid there. That is not the way I see ethics around the world. And I was quite explicit in a couple of articles that I wrote, is that the guidelines that I was responsible for do not aspire to universality. They aspire to global applicability. What does that mean? That means as far as we understand the world as it exists today, the standards that we set up will be applicable at least everywhere we know about. That means, unlike universal principles, which are valid without regard to time or place, that we will have to revise our ethical documents every few years as circumstances change. My belief is that ethical principles are not universal, that ethical principles, systems of ethics, are created in conversations that take place within particular cultures, and they necessarily reflect the histories and traditions of the cultures in which these conversations take place.
Suppose that you were still chair of the IRB at Yale, and one of your colleagues said, I'm going to Saudi Arabia to study a disease there. I have a Saudi colleague who's going to be my co-investigator. And this is a condition of women's health. And so we're going to go and recruit women to be in this study. And by the way, the person who makes the decision for women to have any form of health care and to participate in research is either their husband, their father, or their brother. And so I've written my consent document to be I so-and-so on behalf of my sister, daughter, wife, hereby consent. And they say, you know, we went there with our anthropologist colleagues, and they explained to us the culture, and we explained the necessity of not having doctors do things, research, just on their own, by their own wish. They have to have consent. And we were told, and here's the consenter in this culture.
Right.
Okay?
That sounds like an interesting hypothetical that I have dealt with at least in two arenas.
Okay.
One arena is when I was chair of the IRB at Yale University. We were presented with precisely that problem or that proposition in another one of the Middle Eastern countries. And another one was that when I was chair of the SIAMS, the guidelines writing, the SIAMS committee that revised the guidelines for the 1993 iteration. We necessarily struck a compromise. The compromise in SIAMS, the way it's worded, is a little awkward. It says there are some cultures in which consent is not to be given by the particular person who's going to be the subject of the study. It's going to be given by some other person. In many cases, if the subject is to be a woman, that the consent is given either by, in the Middle East, by a man. In sub-Saharan Africa, the mother-in-law might be the one that gives consent. And we specified that in any event, you must get consent from the woman who will be the subject of the study. You have to go through all of the elements of information that you would be offering. If the research is being carried out in Western cultures. And in the SIAMS guideline, it said perhaps the consent given by the woman would be pro forma because she doesn't dare, this is not the language of the guideline, but it doesn't dare differ from what the expectations of culture are. And we give the advice that perhaps in such cases the consent ought to be discussed by a woman who is from that culture, who would be sensitive to perhaps meta language or nonverbal cues about whether the woman really wanted to do this. That's a cop-out, but that's what we wrote in our guidance.
And do you feel that's where you still stand on that as a current issue, as research takes place in more and more non-Western places?
I'm torn about that. I don't know what the right answer to that is. In fact, I don't think there is a right answer to that. In general, I am in favor of giving every individual who would enter into a research program as a subject the entitlement, the authority to be self-determining. That's my American, that's because I'm situated in the world as an American. But I recognize that things are different elsewhere. I still don't dare depart from it that far. There are things that go on in other cultures that I find bothersome. Some are, in fact, repugnant. The most obvious example is the infundibulation that's practiced in some of the African and Middle Eastern, well, mostly in African countries. Our anthropologists have found a way to stand back from that, to be aware that it's going on and not to get involved in any combative situations that they can avoid. I don't have the answer to that, Alex. And the other thing I say is that if you're going to do this using funding from the American government, you're going to get informed consent, whether it makes sense culturally or not.
You expressed some doubts not only about the universality of autonomy as an idea, self-determination in research by the participants, but also the issue of whether beneficence is a universal principle.
Well, that was a debate that was carried out by the Commission. Is beneficence a fundamental ethical principle? And the conclusion that they came to was that beneficence is not a universal principle, except in certain specific contexts, like the practice of medicine, where you have a professional commitment to do things that will contribute to the well-being of your patient, or in research, where you've got two obligation-creating contingencies. One is that you've accepted public money in exchange for a commitment you have promised in your grant application to try to produce something of value. It can either be something that will contribute to the well-being of your individual research subject, or it can be something that will be of value in the sense of contributing to the fund of generalizable new knowledge. So you've undertaken that commitment. The other thing is that when you get informed consent, you tell the prospective subject that I'm going to do this, and here is my purpose. And the purpose usually has something to do with, I'm going to try to bring benefit to people like you. And if we're fortunate, it might actually even bring some benefit to you. If this, let's say, remedy that we're evaluating proves to be what we hope it is, safe and effective, you might get some good out of it. The IRB never permits that as if you join up with this research study, you're going to get better. That's right. Off limits. Yeah. So it was in this limited beneficence in the, if you want the inside story on beneficence, most of the commission said, no, that's not a principle. And the forceful arguer to whom I referred this morning, Joe Brady, with his Jesuit education, said, oh yes, beneficence is a principle, and he carried the day on that one as well. And not that he rammed it down anyone's throat. He convinced people that given the contingencies of research and the way you contract to do it, it becomes a strict obligation.
He wasn't the only Jesuit-trained person on the commission.
No.
You associate this particularly with a Catholic view of
Joe repeatedly referred to the fact that the idea of doing good for other people came from his Jesuit training. I think David Lewisell was also Jesuit educated. And I don't...
Al Johnson?
Well, Al Johnson was a Jesuit priest.
Yes.
Except during the commission he resigned the priesthood.
But not his moral education.
No. But Joe was the one who really argued most vociferously. Al Johnson said, Al always had a cute way of putting things. He quoted Plato, I think it was, either I think of Plato, as saying that when Zeus created the world, he gave two ethical principles, respect and justice. So Plato left it out. Now justice, the National Commission easily accepted respect for persons. With some debate, accepted beneficence. But justice was not something that, the National Commission first looked at ethical principles in terms of what do we find in the preceding documents in Nuremberg and in Helsinki, and they found nothing that smacked of justice in there. There was one statement in the preamble to the Nuremberg Code that the subjects of the research were asocial people, or in more familiar language, the Nazis referred to these people as life unworthy of life. And you could read that as the people who wrote Nuremberg had some justice-based sentiments about, well, it's not proper to use such people as research subjects. But the one who spearheaded getting justice into the ethical principles of the commission was Karen Labax. And Karen developed a lifelong commitment to studies on justice, even wrote a major book on justice. But she's the one that argued very much that for the idea that people who were what we came to call vulnerable or disadvantaged were entitled to very special consideration.
Well, certainly with the Tuskegee study having been the impetus for the creation of the National Commission, you would think that justice would have constantly been on people's mind because there was an illustration of a vulnerable group, a marginalized group being treated very unjustly. So I'm surprised that, granted, you're quite right, that up until that time, medical ethics and then the emerging field of bioethics had been much more dealing with the struggle between beneficence in the form of paternalism and autonomy in the form of informed consent and self-determination. But I would have thought that third lodestar there was pretty prominent in discussions.
Karen went even deeper than that. She said, everybody has a sense of justice. She said, I'll never forget this, if you put a piece of cake on the table and you've got two children and you divide it and you don't get it exactly even, the one who gets a smaller piece will say, that's not fair.
Right.
And she said, that's justice as fairness, using Rawls's formulation. And Rawls published his theory of justice just about 3 years before the commission was convened, and it was an extraordinarily influential book.
Yeah.
But Tuskegee was not the only thing that gave impetus to the National Commission. I mean, I put some of them on my slide this morning. There was the sterilization of those mentally retarded sisters. There was the thalidomide story. One of the key turning points was the fact that 1 year earlier the Supreme Court issued the Roe v. Wade decision. And the act that created the commission had as a major impetus, heading off the most strident anti-abortion elements. One of the big arguments of the day was you've got to outlaw fetal research because doctors were inspired, incentivized, if I can use a modern nounization, to get abortions in order to produce material to do research. In one of the papers I wrote, I said, this is foolish argument. There are already far too many abortions. There's so much, if you use the tissues from aborted fetuses, the supply of fetal tissue was far greater than the demand to have fetal tissue to do research. But that was a turning point, and that's why we have this peculiarly imbalanced act that created the commission, which gave them 2 years to do everything except fetal research. They got 4 months to give us a report on whether and when and how fetal research can be done.
During which time there was a moratorium on federal support for such research.
Exactly.
And also gave us the Ethics Advisory Board eventually as the body that would look at research with the fetus or...
Well, the Ethics Advisory Board was meant to continue after the commission, and the first case they were presented with had to do with the development of fetoscopy, and a topic that's near and dear to my heart because my colleague Jerry Mahoney was at the center of that development. But they also, the Ethics Advisory Board also issued a very important decision on whether or not you could maintain the developing data during a randomized clinical trial as confidential without feeding it back to the research subjects. In those days, and to this day, we don't even tell the researchers what the developing data are for fear of inducing a bias. But they made a very wise and important decision that you could maintain the confidentiality of those data.
You said a moment ago that a very conventional view that a researcher has these two duties, a duty of beneficence to non-maleficence to the subject, doing the best as possible and not doing harm if possible, and on the other hand, the duty to science and knowledge, the development of knowledge. Given the fact that since the time that you first became a researcher, we've had a sea change in the funding of research. Back then, most research was being done in academic centers, and most of it was funded by the federal government. Today, most clinical trials have moved out of academic centers, and both in the basic research, but particularly in the applied clinical research, most of it's funded by drug companies who hold their data for as long as they can close to their chest, who are developing something for the benefit of their stockholders, not for the benefit of abstract science and the like. Does that change your view as to how we should approach?
Well, first, Alex, the way you've presented this is not perfectly in agreement with my vision of how
That's fine.
Of how the research world is developed. Until 1962, randomized clinical trials were not done by much of anybody. We had a randomized clinical trial in '47 to evaluate streptomycin to treat tuberculosis. We didn't have another randomized clinical trial that measured up to contemporary standards until around 1960. Why did clinical trials suddenly pop up? Well, it had to do with the fact that in 1962, Congress passed the Harris-Kefauver amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Until '62, all the drug company had to do in order to get its drug in the marketplace was to show it was safe. The '62 amendment said you have to show it's effective. How were you supposed to show that it was effective? It said you had to have substantial evidence based upon adequate and controlled clinical trials. Wow, what a bonanza for the statisticians. If you look at the legislative history, they were not talking about randomized clinical trials. In the 1950s, clinical trials where the drug company would give doctors in practice samples. Try these out on your patients and let us know how it works. Are you happy with this? Was not data. But that was what they would use to support their claims that, look, this drug is good. 1,000 doctors said it was. But when they wrote the legislation calling for adequate and well-controlled trials, enter the statisticians. And we developed an industry. Randomized clinical trials became very formal and, incidentally, very satisfactory devices to figure out whether or not a drug was, particularly whether it was effective. And as you went along, you also accumulated less well-controlled data to show whether or not it had serious adverse effects. Now, in the beginning, I see Joan's with us. She quotes the Bible, I'll quote the Bible. In the beginning, the drug company was always responsible for presenting to FDA the grounds to support its petition that they be licensed to distribute a drug commercially in the United States. And it never was the business of academia to establish efficacy, safety, or anything else about drugs. If somebody in academia got interested in a drug because it had a particularly interesting effect or mechanism of action, they would do research on it. They might even ask for a federal grant. But the federal grant never said, I want to see if this drug is safe and effective. The federal grant would say, I want to see what the effect is of digitalis on the electrophysiology of the heart and whether or not that's connected with anything good might come of that in the management of arrhythmias. It was a very different exercise. I will tell you how the National Commission thought about it. They said, in this large collection of activities that we are calling research, some of it is non-developmental research, basic research. How does the pancreas work? Not how can you fix it or make it work better. Beneficence, a single principle named beneficence, was applied to that because the benefit was knowledge that would be useful. In the 60s, one of the first sentences you would see in a basic science journal was, we decided to do this study because this was unknown. It didn't say because if we knew it, we could improve the human condition. The thing that was intolerable to a good basic scientist was that there was something we could know that we don't know. And they would write a grant, I want to study this because no one knows the answer. They also recognized that some of the research that was being done in 1975 was developmental. They want to develop a better treatment for cancer, for diabetes, for whatever. Beneficence then had two prongs. Benefit for the individual research subject, if you're lucky, or if you're not lucky, knowledge that will be useful in benefiting future subjects or individuals who have the same problems that the current subjects have. It was never put in terms of the medical requirement to benefit individual patients. That was never the primary goal of research. If you did something that would benefit individual patients, that could have some effect on justifying doing research on what were then called the special populations. And if you look at the regulations for research involving children, there are certain thresholds. If what you're doing is minimal risk, generalized beneficence is good enough. If you have a minor increase above minimal risk, the goal of the research would be to develop knowledge that was of vital importance right? To ameliorating the condition that these children have. That put pediatric researchers in a big bind, because if they ever wanted to develop normal control information, the subjects would be normal children, and nothing was of vital importance to ameliorating their condition. To this day, we're debating what is a condition. There's been some creative responses to that. So, yes, Alex, the scene has changed. But even in the 1960s, before there was a national commission, those of us who were working, I was a clinical pharmacologist, I was interested in developing drugs. We would criticize the drug companies for what we call the horsepower effect, right? Drug company A has a drug. I mean, one of the classics was one of the phenothiazine tranquilizers. And drug company B says, we have another phenothiazine tranquilizer, and instead of giving 25 milligrams, you only have to give 5 milligrams. More powerful, that's better. But in every other respect, the results seem precisely the same. And our gallows humor was calling this the horsepower effect. Same in the field of diuretics. This has become magnified. There is entirely too much energy on the part of the pharmaceutical industry trying to corner a piece of the market, a market that is already quite well satisfied by what's out there. This is something that the National Commission was aware of, but did not concentrate on. It thought, well, you know, it's kind of the analogy of, well, boys will be boys, you know. Some of these people are going to do things that do not bring all that much benefit to that many people. But there we also had the policies of the FDA, which was not permitted to take into account whether a drug that was whether an application for a marketing permit represented something that was superior to or equal to what was already in the marketplace. They were limited in their considerations to evaluating this drug.
Safe and effective.
Right.
That's it.
Not whether it was more safe or more effective.
Right.
Now they can make comparative judgments.
I'd like to take a different angle on things and ask you, under the heading of the law of unintended consequences, what is it about our present regulation of research, the manner in which it's carried out, the rules under which it's carried out, that could be traced back to the Belmont report and all the other reports from the National Commission that you think has turned out least well, that maybe you were intending one thing and today we have something very different? Anything under that watch out what you wish for?
Yeah, because you might get it. I think one of the big mistakes is that the National Commission failed in its attempt to put brackets around what IRBs ought to be doing. The National Commission tried and failed to introduce a category of activity called expedited review. When they did this, they said basically that this was expedited review is to be permitted based upon the history of the institution. Did they have experience with the particular procedure being brought forward for consideration? And had they considered it enough in the past? So that they pretty well could prejudge what the outcome would be of their deliberations, in which case there was no need to take up the time of the entire committee. What they did in order to illustrate what they were talking about is they took a draft document that was being circulated in the clinical center of things that could be considered for expedited review. But then the regulation writers took it and this is it. These procedures and not anything else. That was a failure. It was well-intended thing that the National Commission did. But to go further, the National Commission was asked whether they might exempt some types of research from coverage. One of the great heroes of the early days of Primer was one E.L. Patello, also known as Pat. Pat would come to our meetings and say, look, I'm a psychologist. I run the Institute for Behavioral Medicine. My colleagues and I do nothing other than talk to people. We don't hurt them. And any regulation of what we do is a constraint on freedom of speech. And there was a lot of merit to what he said. But in those days, there were some constraints, but most of the review of social and behavioral research was fairly light-handed. It's become a very onerous proposition. I am now a member of a National Research Council committee to, I forget the exact name of it, but in essence it is to recommend ways to interpret the common rule so that it's conducive to the conduct of social, behavioral, and educational research. In fact, our next meeting is in 3 days.
Didn't you start off with the view that biomedical and behavioral research were pretty much the same?
No. What I said was that biomedical and behavioral research were inextricably interconnected, so that so much of what we did in medical research was using behavioral techniques in order to achieve a medical goal. A big thing at the time of the National Commission was trying to desensitize people to various stressors in order to control hypertension. Or another thing that was done by a Yale postdoctoral fellow was to show that certain types of thinking greatly increased blood pressure, like doing mental arithmetic would really raise your blood pressure. And I had many examples like that. And I said, if you try to develop separate rules, you're going to have great problems disentangling these things. I never said that when somebody goes out and does sociology, that this is hard to differentiate from randomized clinical trials.
In the 31 years that you chaired the Yale IRB, I assume there were some developments in the way the committee went about its work and so forth. Mm-hmm. Were they driven by changes in the federal rules, or just you developed new best practices about the right way to review research?
They were both. I first became chair in 1969, and that's before there were any federal regulations at all. We had Donald Chalkley's Yellow Book with the Vitruvian Man on the front cover. But these were guidelines. These were not real regulations. We first saw regulations in 1971 when the Food and Drug Administration issued some minimal regulations that covered, among other things, informed consent. And then in '74 we saw the big introduction of a whole body of regulations by what was then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And that had a major impact on us. Basically, almost everything in the '74 regulations were things that we were already attentive to, although the ways in which we were attentive were not necessarily in compliance with the letter of the new law. So that had a major impact.
Can you give me an example? What would be something that you were doing that you would not be able to do after this?
Well, it's not so much of not being able to do it. It's a matter of what sort of language are you putting in your consent documents that would parallel the language that was in the federal law regulation. It was not as if we previously did not advise people of the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, but there were certain subtleties in the language that required that we do it in a somewhat different style. I can't recall anything that was a drastic change in our approach to things that came out of the '74 regulation.
How about other changes? Did the committee become more efficient? Did it spend more time on ethical issues? Did it spend more time making sure it was meeting the terms of the regulations?
Well, when we began to get regulations for the special populations, when we received regulations on research involving the fetus in 1975, this had a drastic effect on research that was being done on the fetus and on in vitro fertilization. When we got regulations for research involving prisoners, we had a major phase 1 drug study group at Yale and essentially closed their doors. When we got regulations in 1983 on research involving children, then we have minimal risk, we have, minor increase, vital importance, disorders, all that stuff were new things that we had to cope with. My committee met twice a month on the 2nd and 4th Wednesday of each month. And on months that had a 5th Wednesday in it, we had what we called a policy meeting. And that's where we got together and if we had collected a set of issues over the time since our last policy meeting, we would say, okay, do we need a policy to address this issue? And we introduced a number of changes in our procedures and practices. One of our most important ones was fairly early on in the 1970s. We introduced a primary reviewer system. The primary reviewer was any member of the committee who the investigator chose to be his or her primary reviewer. And the responsibility of our primary reviewer was to advise, to work as a consultant to the investigator, to say, here's the stuff you got to get in your protocol. If you get it all in there, I can't tell you that your protocol will be approved, but I can tell you it will not be tabled, because the most common reason for tabling a protocol would be the investigator left something out, a segment of information. And with our committee member serving as an advisor, we had no such omissions. And we were very proud of our turnaround time. We usually gave the investigator a final decision within 2 weeks, counting the revisions, back and forth. But if we had to table a protocol, that meant at least a 2-week postponement, which for us was a big deal. And then when the sociologists came in and started studying committees around the country, I found that a 2-week postponement was a drop in the bucket. The other universities were taking months to turn around these protocols. So that was one of our, and we found with the passage of time that far and away the most likely members of our committee to be consulted as primary reviewers were the students. Why? Because the faculty members were busy. They're doing their own research. They're teaching their classes. They're writing grants and so on. The students considered this an enormous opportunity to be invited into the office of a major contributor to research and to get a look at what this individual was thinking about a year before the research even got started. So they saw this as a combination of tutorial for me, advice for you. So they were very diligent, and the faculty quickly learned that these are our best primary reviewers. During the reign of Gary Ellis at OPRR, the Office for Protection from Research Risks, there were a series of closures of university research operations. Not just closing down one research project, but closing down the entire university's research operation. And this struck some of the most prestigious institutions: Duke, Johns Hopkins, I mean, the big name players in the game. And as we looked at the reasons that these institutions were closed, they seemed to be over minor infractions. Sometimes we never were told, there was never a public statement of, we closed Duke because they broke that rule. What we would get is OPRR's letter to the institution that had a list of observations. These closures absolutely freaked out people in the universities. People would say, well, you know, they closed down the institution, you put all your troops on the case, and within less than a week, you can get approval to get up and running again. But nobody could estimate the horrendous disruption in a clinical trial where you have to tell all the patients, we can't give you your drugs anymore. When the local newspaper would run a banner headline, University Hospital research operation closed for violating federal regulations. Oh, wow. Nobody knew what these regulations were or what the violations were, but the impact on the institution was enormous. Well, as time went on, the OPRR and subsequently OHRP, Office for Human Research Protection, issued a new set of standards. The one I want to focus on is that it said that every institution had to have an institutional official with whom they could communicate. And part of the job description for this institutional official was that she or he would have the authority to change policy in the institution, which meant many of the institutional officials were appointed in the university at the level of deputy provost, or in many cases the provost himself or herself. Well, in the past, OPRR could communicate with the IRB chair, who knew exactly what was going on. You want to talk about protocol number 631? Let me pull it out of my file. Now they're talking to the deputy provost, who knows from nothing. They don't know anything, but they do have the authority to change policy in the institution. Well, the provosts were under the guns from the upper echelons of the university. Don't you let them close our school down. And so they took this list of observations. In fact, there was a fellow named Berman who collected them all and published them in an article in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And all of these new institutional officials took this list of observations and said, if we don't do any of those things, it's like buying insurance. We will lessen the probability that we'll get hit with one of these closures. These observations were, I'll give you one hilarious example. One institution was closed because they did not carry all the protocols that were up for annual review to the meeting. The provost at our school read it and said, we will have all those protocols at the meeting. And I said, you know how many protocols those are? And to make a long story short, we were presented with a gift of 2 Stop and Shop shopping carts to put all the protocols in and push them into the meeting. It's out of that we get this drumbeat, this crescendo drumbeat of complaint. They are focusing us on not merely meticulous attention to minor detail, but on the meticulous documentation of our having paid attention to things that nobody ever thought was worth doing in the first place. And that has sowed the seeds of discontent out there. And they, almost all of them, blame the federal government. And in an indirect way, the federal government's responsible. But the people who really took the actions that created this problem are the institutional officials at the universities. And then we get an accreditation agency who gives you an accreditation which is based upon whether or not you comply with all of this silliness. And there's my intermediate length response to your nice question.
One last question. You chaired the IRB at Yale 31 years. You've been a primer board member and a contributor for almost 30 years. You've been a influential editor in medicine and clinical investigation, founded the IRB Journal for the Hastings Center, served on boards. Which of your contributions do you think is going to be the most lasting? And is that the one which you are also most proud of?
I think my main contribution has been clarifying the language used in American regulation and in the international regulation. And when you talk about anonymous, I gave an example this morning about how my contributions were so anonymous that I didn't even know I made them. It took Hank Ten Hove to tell me that I introduced the word vulnerable to the language of bioethics. So there you go with anonymity. I think that is my most important contribution to the world of research ethics. What is my most important professional, most satisfying professional achievement? It's being a mentor to a number of young people who did their MD theses with me and are now in leadership positions around the world. These people bring me my memory of my work with these people. And that's why I made such a special point of saying when I got the Lifetime Achievement Award, I wanted the speakers to be my students.
Well, thank you, and I have avoided asking you what kind of tree you would be if you were a tree. Thank you, Bob.
I'd be a bristlecone pine,
Okay.
and I'd live for 5,000 years.